Hi everyone, my name is Jenny and today I'm back to do another video. Today I'm going to be doing my June wrap up. Now I'm going to be honest, June did not, at the least at the beginning of the month, feel like a very good reading month. I was kind of starting to feel a little reading slumpy-y towards the end of May, and then with George Floyd's murder and the protests that happened after that for several weeks and are continuing to happen, my mind just kind of was elsewhere for a lot of the first half of the month, and reading was just not really engaging me, and I was not really reading a lot of books that I really enjoyed. However, things did turn around during the second half of the month. That I did manage to finish 12 books, and I DNF'd one book, which is pretty good. And I also read several books that potentially are going to be favorites of the year that I really enjoyed. However, there were quite a few other books that were also kind of duds of the month, and those particularly stuck out in my mind, especially as I said in that first half. So kind of bear in mind that this is a pretty mixed bag here in terms of my June wrap up, but I do think that I've gotten my reading mojo back, especially because the last two books I read I enjoyed pretty well, and then I'm currently reading 5 books. So all of those seem to be going quite well as well. So hopefully July will look even better. I know the reading rush is coming, and I'm hoping to kind of just get a lot of reading in July. So with all of that being said, let's just kind of jump right into my June wrap up. On the 12th of June, I put out a Friday Reads video, which just was to talk about the books that I read in the first kind of 12 days of the month, as I didn't want to save them till this video since I likely would not be able to give as in-depth of reviews as I wanted to. So I think I'm probably going to keep that format, or maybe do like a mid-month wrap-up moving forward, just because I do read enough books and I like to talk about them in some depth that these videos at the end of the month, 1, get really long, and 2, I don't remember the books I read at the beginning of the month quite as well. So the 2 books that I talked about in that Friday Reads video, which I will put a link to up in the cards above, are You Never Forget Your First by Alexis Coe. This is a biography of George Washington that I really enjoyed. I gave it 4 stars, would highly recommend it. Again, talked about it more in that video. And the other was The Margot Affair by Sinai Lamon, which was a debut book that I received early from NetGalley. It came out on the 16th of June, so it is available now. And I gave this one 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it, but there were a couple things I didn't particularly like, and I talked about all of those more in that Friday Reads video. The next video that I put out this month, wherein I talked about a book I read this month, was my first video for my African Women Writers Project, and that was The Dragonfly Sea by Yvonne Adiyampo Aworo. So I put a review and discussion video of this out during the middle of the month, around the 16th of June, which I'll also put a link to up in the cards above. This one I gave 3.5 stars. There were a few kind of writing style things I didn't particularly love in this one, but there was a lot of room for discussion in terms of the themes that I'm kind of exploring in that reading project. So I'd highly recommend you check out that video to learn more about kind of the more academic side of reading this text. But I did really enjoy that first aspect, and I'm excited to continue with that project. Then I also finished this month 10 minutes 38 seconds in This Strange World by Leif Shafak. I read this for the BookTube Prize semifinals, which I need to continue my reading for that as it is already July and I've only read this one out of the 4 books that I need to read. But I can't talk about this one as it's a BookTube Prize book, so I'll be releasing a vlog with all of my thoughts on the 6 books that are in my round at the end of this month in July. During that Friday Reads video, I also talked about 4 books that I was currently in the middle of that I have since finished since that video. So I'll go over those first, and then the books that I've not talked about anywhere on my channel. So the first book I finished from that Friday Reads video was Perennials by Mandy Berman. This one I picked up at the Women and Children's First bookstore in Chicago back in January when I was visiting my best friend who lives in Chicago. And just thinking about that makes me miss seeing friends and going to independent bookstores. But I bought this at the recommendation of one of the staff members there, not necessarily like an in-person recommendation, but they have a large kind of like staff recommends table that I believe I picked this up from. And unfortunately, it was incredibly disappointing after that recommendation. This book takes place at a summer camp that these two kind of in the outskirts, suburban, rural Connecticut area, like outside of New York City. And this follows 2 girls, one of whom is from the city and the other of whom is from like Westchester County or Connecticut, I can't quite remember where. And it basically just kind of follows their friendship, theoretically, over the course of several summers as they kind of learn to grow up through their experiences at summer camp. And unfortunately, while that was the premise, that wasn't really the plot of this novel, because this novel had no plot. It was really some interconnected short stories about people all who were attending the summer camp during the summer of 2006, all of whom have just like random stuff happen to them. Most of it's like tragic for no apparent reason, and it's just like not at all very nuanced or interesting to read about. None of the characters are interesting. And the writing is just like really simplistic and basic, especially for a literary fiction novel. Like, I'm kind of surprised that this came out of an MFA program because it is just like so simplistic writing. So I really didn't like any of those elements of it. But then on top of that, there was some very weird and like questionable / disturbing social commentary, mainly about kind of the sexualization and also like sexual intercourse between like decidedly underage people, which I know, you know, sometimes like 14, 15, even 13-year-olds have sex at like summer-long sleepaway camps. Like, I know that is sometimes something that happens depending on like the kind of culture of the sleepaway camp. However, as an adult, I didn't feel comfortable reading or hearing about like 14-year-olds that like lost their virginity to each other at summer camp. It just didn't feel appropriate to me as an adult reader reading about summer camp. Additionally, there's also quite a discussion about even younger girls, like 10, 11, 12, who are first getting their period. And obviously I think like menstruation is something that should be more normalized and more discussed in fiction as well as kind of in the mainstream media more broadly. However, that discussion of menstruation then kind of came alongside this discussion of like the development of like breasts and like sexualization of that, which for like when we're talking about 12-year-olds just made me deeply uncomfortable and disturbed that like this was a book published in 2017 and we're like talking about children's breasts. Like, it just did not feel appropriate, was not fun to read about. And that was kind of like the main thing that was happening throughout this novel. It was just like different children talking about being sexualized, and I was just like, this is not appropriate or like fun to read about. So not really great on any sense. There was also another character who experiences like pretty extreme body dysmorphia. That is not discussed by like any other character. Her parents are like, oh, she thinks she's fat, oh well. And it's like, what? Like, this is insane. Even for like 2006, it felt like, you know, someone, whether that be her closest, like her best friend or her parents or other people that are at summer camp, I feel like would have had a conversation with her, and that would have made for a better like plot point in the novel, is to kind of discuss that instead of this one character just like constantly being like, oh well, I have body dysmorphia, but I don't like know what that is. So yeah, in terms of like the social commentary of those two things, I was just like, this book is really not working for me. I gave it 2 stars. If that, I really would not recommend it whatsoever, and I am going to get rid of it actually tomorrow. So moving on to another book set in the like outside New York area. That was actually a common theme, as I read a lot of books that had some part of the story that took place in the like New York broader area. So the next one I finished was All Adults Here by Emma Straub. This one I actually got from Books Are Magic, which is Emma Straub's bookstore in Brooklyn, and so I do have a signed copy, which is really fun. I read and loved both of Emma Straub's most recent books, Modern Lovers and The Vacationers, back in 2016. I think it was the summer of 2016. And I really enjoyed them. So I believe when I heard about her new release sometime last year, I was really excited about it. And so I actually pre-ordered this from them in anticipation of me thinking I would really enjoy this. So in this novel, we follow Astrid as well as her family. Astrid is an older widower who has 3 grown-up children, all of whom have children of their own. As Astrid sees a woman at the very beginning of the novel who she is friendly with, but not necessarily friends with, who lives in the small town, hit by a school bus and killed kind of right in the center of town. And after this event occurs, Astrid begins to kind of question her own life and the choices that she's made, particularly in relationship to her children. And in addition to Astrid kind of questioning all of that, we also follow Astrid's children and one of her grandchildren, who is about like 12 or 13 in the novel. So it's kind of a big family story. This one does not take place during the summer, which her previous 2 novels did, which I kind of enjoyed. And it was fine. I think it was pretty classic Emma Straub in that she is a novelist that kind of writes these like classic beach read books that I believe have a bit more kind of heart and wisdom than necessarily is like typical of the beach read type genre, but I definitely think this is still like appropriate for like casual sitting by the pool, which is not something I'm inherently against at all. I think that's a really, you know, nice genre. So in terms of its like depth, it was not literary fiction, but I didn't expect it to be. However, I do think this did try to tackle some pretty important contemporary issues, quite a few of them in fact, in terms of their, and this is slightly spoilery I guess, but so, you know, beware if you are like very anti-spoilers. It does include a kind of a coming to terms with your bisexuality later in life, as well as a long-term affair, and kind of realizing the repercussions and the negative aspects of that affair. There's also a child who is discovering that who is coming into their own in terms of kind of expressing their trans identity. And then there's also just a lot of kind of discussions of like forgiving your parents and thinking about how your parents impacted your life now, which are all interesting. I do think since there were so many of these like kind of social commentary topics, they were not as fleshed out as they necessarily could have been, but I do still enjoy this, and I think if you like Emma Straub and have read her in the past, I don't necessarily think you'll dislike this, but it's not necessarily groundbreaking in terms of her work, nor do I really even think this is like the best of her work. But I did enjoy it. It was like a pretty solid read, so I gave it like 3.25 stars. Again, it was during the first half of the month, and I think I wasn't as engaged as I maybe could have been had I read it at a different time. But yeah, I would still like recommend this if this is a type of genre that you like to read. Next up, we actually have the book that kind of turned the whole month around for me. This is a book that I definitely think is a strong contender for that like top books of the year, and that is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. Now, I actually read this as an ebook from my library, but I was enjoying it so much that I realized I wanted to just like have a copy of it. Additionally, my sister, who's home for the summer from Washington, D.C., loves N.K. Jemisin, and so I figured that she would probably want to read it before the summer is over. But yeah, I just enjoyed this one so much that I was like, I have to have my own copy. Plus, it's like really beautifully done, so it will look nice on my bookshelf, so I was like, sure, I'll get a copy of it. So this one, in terms of its plot, is slightly challenging to explain, but I'm gonna try to do my best. So in this world, which is our world pretty much, there is this idea that once a city has kind of gotten its own unique enough identity and culture within the city, that it then awakens into basically kind of an embodiment of the city's culture and people as a real person. So a like real human kind of becomes the embodied, for example, like Hong Kong has an embodied person that is the culture and people of Hong Kong, that is distinct enough from the surrounding region that Hong Kong has become this embodied place. So at the start of the novel, we are witnessing the awakening of New York City that has reached this point where its culture and people are unique enough that it can have its own embodied being. And because New York City has 5 boroughs, it actually has 6 of these embodied beings, one of whom is the like embodiment of New York City as a whole, and then the other 5 are each of the 5 boroughs. But as the city is awakening, we are experiencing the people must fight this kind of evil force that is not named for most of the novel, but it becomes clear at the end of towards the end of the novel what it is. And this is a trilogy, so I assume that will obviously be explored more in future books, that basically wants to take root in New York City as it's awakening to then send New York City into a like new different direction that obviously would be detrimental to like the people of New York City. So that's kind of the premise, but now onto kind of my personal thoughts about this, which is that, as I said, I absolutely loved this novel. Definitely going to be one of my favorites of the year. In the author's note, N.K. Jemisin says that this is a love letter to New York City, a place that she has called home for several years. I know she spent some of her formative, I think, teenage years on the Gulf Coast of Alabama, but has spent a lot of her life in New York City. And you can definitely tell that she kind of thinks and acts like a native New Yorker would. Her passion and her love and just kind of her complex feelings about New York City shine through in this novel so well that I think if you have any experience, both personally with New York City or with people who have that kind of visceral feeling towards New York City, I think you can see that easily shining through this novel. Again, New York is not always portrayed in the best light. There's a lot of things that New York still needs to work on, and I think those are really acknowledged wholeheartedly in this book, but it does showcase New York's ability to really change you and help you to become the person that you're really meant to be. Additionally, I think Jemisin is able to so effortlessly in this novel capture the diversity and the importance of diversity in city spaces, as well as kind of the importance of community and developing communities and developing cultures that a common group of people can kind of commit to and then therefore like continue to thrive. And really kind of the message that cities need these communities and these people that care about cities to really grow and succeed and thrive is something that's so important to this novel that I think N.K. Jemisin really captures in such a beautiful and profound way. Jemisin also does a fantastic job of like positing this novel within the larger discussion of the importance of like social justice and activism and political engagement, and as I said before, community building in fighting against these like evils that can create a lack of diversity and a lack of independent culture within a city, namely gentrification, the corporatization of businesses and the taking over of small businesses, police brutality, white supremacy more broadly. All of these things are discussed so explicitly, but also in such a nuanced way that it really showcases how these evils are perpetuating these ideas of otherness and discomfort surrounding cities and diversity that I think is such an important discussion, especially to be having right now in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement kind of resurgence in mainstream media, that I truly like could not recommend this novel enough, especially right now. So if you have access to this novel, I absolutely would recommend it. I am obsessed. I definitely think, so I've read N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy. For me, this one spoke to me personally a lot more, and so I think I like this one better, but obviously the Broken Earth trilogy is also really good. But I think if you like the themes that N.K. Jemisin explores in that one, you also will like the theme she's exploring in this one. So yeah, would highly recommend this one as well. Definitely a favorite of the year so far. 5 stars, obviously. The next book I have to talk about is the last book that I talked about a little bit in my Friday Reads video, and this is gonna be a bit of a rant, so buckle your seatbelts or skip ahead to the next book if this book is already something you're not going to be interested in. So that next book is going to be The Gulf by Jack E. Davis. Now, I believe, as I said in my Friday Reads video, I actually started this book last summer and read it for about 3 months. I read the first like 200 pages over the course of a very long period, and then decided that I obviously wasn't making very good progress, so I gave up on it. And since I have this TBR reduction project, I figured that it was just time to dive back into this one. It's quite a chunky book. It's like 500 pages plus of like actual text, and then over 100 pages of like the notes and index and stuff. I figured it was time to just like bite the bullet, get back into this book, and listen to the audiobook and kind of be done with it, which I'm glad that I've done, but there were a lot of problems with this book. So this is a nonfiction book that's an environmental history of the Gulf of Mexico, primarily focusing on the present US border that borders the Gulf of Mexico. So mainly the Florida, kind of from the Florida Keys all the way to, he doesn't go much farther than Lake Galveston, but obviously Texas, Corpus Christi, continuing that direction is kind of the main focus of this nonfiction book. And this book begins with the pre-Columbian civilizations that were living along the Gulf Coast and kind of what the archaeological record has told us about what these civilizations were like, and then continues all the way basically to the present day in terms of discussions of like current political machinations and maneuverings, particularly the deregulation of a lot of large companies, particularly in the oil industry, and their relationships with the state governments of several of the states, as well as some of the kind of environmental advocacy groups and movements that we've been seeing in the Gulf region regarding environmental protection on a variety of different fronts. So in terms of its scope, this is quite a large undertaking, and there's a lot to cover here. And I do think if you were a student, especially a student of environmental history, perhaps writing like a term paper on this subject, I think this would be a great resource in terms of better understanding the broader themes, as well as this book is incredibly well researched and really well cited. So the primary source bibliography section of this is really phenomenal. So if I was a student, I think this would be a really helpful text in terms of its ability to help me find primary sources, which does make sense. Davis is an academic at the University of Florida in environmental studies and sustainability. So the fact that he knows how to research well is good to see that in an academic, I guess. However, as you may have noticed, I was not reading this as like a text for me as a student. I was reading it as like a general audience text, which is what it was marketed as. It was not published by like a university press or anything like that. And because of that, I have a lot of problems with it. One, this book is incredibly dry, which I truly, as someone who studied history and finds history really fascinating, I hate to see that stereotype of history like come to light in a book, especially a book that won the Pulitzer Prize, which we'll talk about, because it's like really easy to make history interesting, especially I think a history that is filled with so much like kind of political turmoil as well as like ecological destruction. Like those things can actually be made really interesting and thought-provoking and gripping, and yet this was truly one of the driest books I've ever read. It was so boring. And I think that also was added to by the fact, which was my second and main gripe of the book, in that this is one of the worst books in terms of its organization, both on a book-wide level, but also on a chapter-by-chapter level, in terms of its thesis and its like broader themes and how those themes are connected. One, this book doesn't really have an overarching thesis aside from being a history of the Gulf of Mexico and like the US, you know, the American Sea, if you will, which is not really a thesis. It's kind of just like a statement. And I think anyone who's like taken some like English comp classes could probably tell you that you need to make your thesis more specific. But anyway, this was also true on like a chapter by chapter basis, in that most of the chapters completely lacked a thesis, despite the fact that they had a title that really could have been the thesis, but it just wasn't. So many of the chapters jump through time and place and just, like, theme in a way that just like doesn't make sense. Like, he would talk about someone in like the early 1900s and then like return back to 1870, and it's like, what? Like 40 years have happened between these two things, and also these two things are not related to each other. It did not make sense how he was organizing this book, and I truly could not tell you what the organization of this book was, which I feel like as a history text, especially because history can become so complicated and things can be connected through time, you do have to make it really clear like how things are connected and why you've decided to put certain things together, especially if you're not going to go in a traditional chronological order. That's just my thinking, but obviously Davis does not feel the same. Additionally, Florida and Texas really dominate the narrative, which makes sense because in terms of the American coastline, Florida and Texas obviously have the most Gulf Coast. Alabama has very, very little, and then Mississippi and Louisiana have some, but it's not by any means as large as Florida or Texas is. However, I do think especially Louisiana has a really fascinating history in terms of its relationship to the Gulf, but that may have also just been a kind of me thing. But then my final kind of gripe with the book, and I think this also speaks to just kind of a larger problem in general, is that Davis completely ignores any, so in this history of the coast, the Gulf Coast, he completely ignores any discussion of race, which, one, if you're going to discuss environmental history and environmental justice, particularly in America, you need to acknowledge that people of color face more environmental degradation and exploitation than white people, like, period. The second thing is that, especially in the Gulf Coast, where there's such a prevalence of Creole culture and Black communities doing a lot of the environmental justice work and kind of finding ways to survive given the very challenging environment that the Gulf Coast provides, you'd think that that would be an integral part of understanding the Gulf's cultural and ecological history. And yet, Jackie Davis mentions Black people maybe 3 times, and he mentions Creole people also maybe 3 times over this 500-page book. That is a disgrace. That is deeply upsetting. In fact, I actually, as I was like writing my review for this, I was looking to see if like Creole as a word or a culture was included in the index, and it's not. So I was frankly shocked by that. All of those things together just really made me dislike this book and what it was trying to do, and made me even more frustrated that it won the Pulitzer Prize, given that obviously it is exploring a region of the United States that is looked down upon and considered potentially not as interesting as some other regions, but I think to do it in such a way that so whitewashes and also doesn't provide the history in a nuanced, interesting way is like such a disservice that this book just infuriated me. And so I gave it 2.5 stars. Who knows? I might lower my ranking even more. It just was like not at all what I wanted to see in terms of a history of the Gulf of Mexico and the American coast. Moving on from that fun rant, we have a book that I will talk about very briefly because I really don't remember that much about it, which was The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Niveau. This is a tour novella that I've read about halfway through the month, and as I said, I just don't really remember that much about it. I know it's a like political intrigue that follows 2 women who are trying to kind of cause a rebellion, it seems. It was fine. I enjoyed Niveau's writing style. I think I will hold off reading more of her work until she puts out a full-length novel, which I did see Tor announce that they acquired one of her full-length novels that's set to come out in 2021. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. I liked her writing style, but it really did not capture my attention or like have much staying power whatsoever. So there's that one. Would recommend it if you want like a short, quick read, but for me, it had next to no staying power. So 3 stars for that. Moving on to the next book that I've read, we have The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. I read The Mothers, which was Bennett's debut novel, back in 2016 and really enjoyed it. So then when I started hearing about this one and it was the June Book of the Month pick, I decided that I would try to pick it up. And I'm really glad I did. I really enjoyed this one. So I think Brit Bennett, like Emma Straub, is a really great contemporary writer that's writing these very light novels that have a bit more kind of depth and meaning to them, particularly Brit Bennett in kind of introducing kind of important social discussions of racism and the like. So this story is a historical fiction novel that follows 2 sisters born in a small town in Louisiana in the 1950s, both of whom are very light-skinned. The sisters, when they're in their late teens, end up moving to New Orleans to get a better life, and one of the sisters actually decides that she is going to pass as white and live her life as a white woman. The other sister then moves to Washington, D.C., where she finds a very dark-skinned man and marries him and has a child with him. And we kind of follow the 2 sisters down these very divergent paths over the course of the next 3 decades. We also follow their daughters, as both of them have daughters, and kind of the interweaving stories that the 2 daughters have through the 1990s. So I really enjoyed this one. I think this novel discusses some really important topics, such as the paradoxical nature of like racism and racial identity and how it both is fluid but also incredibly rigid. It discusses colorism quite a bit, which I think is really important. It also has some really important discussions of families and how families are made and broken, which is really interesting. And yeah, I think overall it's a relatively light novel, but it's tackling some really important discussions in a way that I think would be really appropriate for like I don't know, like a book club of like young moms. I think would really actually get a lot out of this novel. And I also got a lot out of this novel. I really enjoyed it. It was a really fast read for me. It's about 350 pages and I read it maybe in like 3 days or so. So I really enjoyed it and I found it to be a really fun, engaging like summer read that I think also made me think more than a typical like summer read would. My one critique I will say is that there were a couple very minor moments or pieces of dialogue where it kind of took me out of the story because it didn't feel at all believable. There's one particular moment that happens towards the end of the novel where it said that he had a PhD from Dartmouth, which I just found a little odd because I feel like it's relatively common knowledge that Dartmouth is somewhat unique as an Ivy League because of its lack of extensive graduate programs, unlike all the other Ivy League institutions. So I just like that, and that may just be me and kind of I didn't go to an Ivy League, but I went to a somewhat Ivy League adjacent like liberal arts college, and so I'm very kind of well entrenched in that like world. So maybe that personally was just something that was going to bother me, but it felt like an easy fix, if that makes sense. And there were a couple other moments where it was like, if this had been like looked up on Google, it would have been an easy fix, which I don't ever really like in novels, where like things that I know to not be true that are very easy to like remedy are not remedied. So that was my only critique, is that there were a couple of those moments, but other than that I really enjoyed this one. Gave it 4.5 stars. Would highly recommend. The second to last book that I finished this month was Other People We Married by Emma Straub. This is her debut short story collection that came out back in 2011, and I picked this up I believe sometime last year because I wanted more Emma Straub to read, and I was not aware of this 2020 release at the time that I picked this up. And I'm actually quite surprised by this one, so I talked about it in TBR reduction plan video, which I'll put a link to up in the cards above, as a book that was on the chopping block because I wasn't sure quite if I actually wanted to read it, but I actually ended up enjoying these stories quite a bit. I am pretty into the short story form right now. It's just kind of what I'm interested in reading, so that may have contributed, but like I'm not complaining. I found these to be surprisingly well done, especially for a debut collection. So all of these stories focus somehow kind of on this idea of other people we married, and that there's a lot of stories about falling in and out of love, as well as the like kind of hypotheticals of relationships, and kind of imagining how a relationship might be different if these two people had not been married and like had a family, or they'd not been married and one of them was still alive, etc., etc. So there's kind of a lot of discussion primarily about romantic relationships in these stories. There also are a lot of similar themes and discussions that you see in Straub's later novels, which is always something fun to read a debut collection by someone that you've read other books from, because you can see some of the themes that they were exploring earlier in their work kind of play out in later novels. So I really enjoyed that kind of aspect to it. I will say none of the stories are particularly ones that I think will be all-time favorites, but none of the stories were also objectively like bad or uninteresting to me either. So I did have a couple kind of standout stories from this collection, which were Abraham's Enchanted Forest, Flyover State, and Puttanesca, which was my favorite. I give this 3.5 stars, would probably recommend it if you like short stories, especially ones that are kind of interesting, dealing with some interesting themes, but are not like super emotionally heavy. And then the last book is definitely another contender for my favorite book of the year, and I actually think that I might do its own review because I have a lot of thoughts and feelings and I think I want to process them in their own video. So I'll just mention it here and tell you kind of my brief thoughts, and then I will hopefully be making a like in-depth review of this one in the near future. So that is the Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd. This one is absolutely incredible. I gave it 5 stars, and I will be putting that video out soon, I think, of kind of explaining more of what I think is so magical and wonderful about this book. Those are all the books that I finished during the month of June. I am currently reading 5 books. In the past, I've done kind of what I'm thinking about them, but I think I'm just going to go over them because this video has already been really long, and I will hopefully be doing a Friday Reads video in the near future that I can kind of talk about all of those books in more depth. But the first one is one that I actually hoped to finish before the month of June was over, but that didn't happen, which is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. This one I only have about 50 pages left. I think I have like 5 chapters maybe, and it's a really thought-provoking read. I'm enjoying it, and I think I'm learning some things. I don't necessarily think I'm necessarily the intended audience, given my education level regarding these topics, but I do think this is a really great resource for those who are continuing on their anti-racism journey. I would recommend it regardless of how much you know about racism and systems of oppression in America. Next up, we have Kindu by Jennifer Nansabuga Makumbi. I'm reading this for my African Women Writers Project. Enjoying it. I'm about 160 pages into this one, so still have about 300 left to go, and I will be putting a review up for this one around the middle of the month. We also have In Other Words by Jhumpa Lahiri. This one is one of my 5-star predictions, so I'm excited to be getting to it. And this one is a Jhumpa Lahiri's memoir. Jhumpa Lahiri is one of my absolute favorite authors, and this is her memoir about finding a home in the Italian language after growing up in America with 2 Bengali parents who had immigrated from India to America, and kind of learning English as her first language, and then finding a kind of place of solitude and fulfillment in Italian in her adult life. And it's actually written, so Jhumpa Lahiri wrote it in Italian. I don't know how well you can see that. And then Anne Goldstein, who will become relevant in a moment, translated it into English. And it's really enjoyable. It's a short little, since half the pages are in Italian, it's a very short little book. So enjoying that one. And then I am also reading, also translated by Anne Goldstein, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. Reading this with my, not IRL book club, but people I know from real life over Zoom. We meet every other month, and this is our June and July pick. I am enjoying this one, only about 60 pages into it, but should be making more progress soon. And then last but not least, I have a buddy read with Lindsay from Lindsay's Bookish Life. I've been following Lindsay for over a year now and absolutely love her channel. She is one of the smartest people, I think, on BookTube. I love hearing her thoughts about books and about her dogs and her classroom and all sorts of fun stuff like that. And together we are reading Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. So this one I'll be reading throughout this first half of July, and I'm quite excited to get to this one, as it is also a 5-star prediction. So those are all the books that I read during the month of June, as well as the books that I'm currently reading. If you have read any of these books or want to read them now because of this video, please let me know down in the comment section below. I'd love to talk about any of them with you. Additionally, if you found my channel somehow through this video, welcome. My name is Jenny. Please give my channel a subscribe if you have not already. And I think that is everything. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you next time.